Glen Grant worked as a defense and reform expert in Ukraine, working for the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. He is also a senior fellow in the UK Institute for Statecraft on building integrity initiative countering Russian influence. Glen graduated from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the Junior Staff Course Warminster, and the Joint Staff Defence College at the Royal Naval College in Greenwich. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on any of the fantastic guests that we feature. And of course, if you like this video, do please place a like against it. It does help people to find new material, new guests, and not miss out on that. Thank you to everyone who's buying me a coffee and various ways of supporting the channel. As some of you will have seen, we've got a trip coming up to Ukraine. It's fairly short notice. We're putting on some big events, filming it. We have to hire a film crew. So I have put a bit of a campaign together for that. Thank you to everybody who started to support the campaign to make that a reality. And of course, for those who are demanding transparency, you will of course see the results of that because we will broadcast those panel events that are happening in Lviv and Kiev. Glen, welcome to the channel.
Welcome, thanks. Before we start, I should just say that times have moved on and the Institute for Statecraft is no longer, but it is relevant because we were deeply attacked by Russia. Right. And everything that we had was trashed. And they made a web page for me specifically about all the things that I've been doing. So which I've left on a Wikipedia page, which I've left on there. But we're still doing work, as you can imagine. I'm in and out of Ukraine all the time.
And you're part of the Baltic Security Foundation, which is going to be my first question there.
This is a collection of, you might say, collection of friends. All of us who've been working in the defence, most of us who've been working in the defence sector previously, or still are, in some cases, and yeah, we work on issues around the Baltics and Ukraine. And so we've written quite a lot about it, even to the extent of China in Ukraine. How do the NATO structures affect us in terms of military? How does the military gel with our Latvian, Estonian, and now of course Finnish and Swedish military? And what structures is NATO putting in place so we can all work in concert, as opposed to working individually as individual nations. And there's a lot of work going on of that at the moment, of course, created by the attacks on the pipelines and the power structures, because it just highlights that we're still not quite NATO in the Baltics. The NATO sea bit has not yet become a reality, and we're still Finland, Sweden, Latvia, Estonia. But I'm pretty sure that in NATO headquarters, they're stewing on that one pretty quickly because it's as topical as anything can be.
Well, I've got questions about that and JEF and the sort of, the provocations that Russia has conducted and how they're likely to go. Before we sort of get into that, it's probably worth analysing the even bigger elephant in the room, which is it seems that Putin is not just intent on challenging Article 5, not just intent on prodding and poking the allies in a way that, of course, the Soviet Union did by buzzing UK airspace and territorial waters and so on. It seems that he has a much more grandiose ambition than the Soviet Union had, which is to tear down these institutions, to render them inoperable, and if he can, consign them to history. If we look at the sort of, the minutiae of the different provocations, are we missing that elephant in the room?
That's a big question. And it comes down to, what we actually think his ambitions are and what his leanings are towards Russia. I think that one of the things that I've been looking at quite hard is this you could call it oligarch strata, which runs across the whole world, and these the rich and the rich and the powerful, and how they are taking over countries in effect, and of course it's getting much more dangerous in terms of companies now that are larger than the majority of GDPs of countries in the world. And of course, this is a real problem for us. And Trump is definitely one of those. And so though he may not be actually leaning definitely towards Russia, but he leans towards Putin's views and ideas. And he is in accord with those ideas. So the elephant in the room is that he's acting in a similar way to Putin, and he's acting in a similar way to Xi, or he would like to act in a similar way. And then the question is, will Congress actually stop him and say, hey, haul back some of the things you're saying are total idiocy, or will we have a relationship as Germany had with Russia at the beginning of the war, with Putin trying to have a relationship with the other big countries and creating zones of influence that do or do not include Europe. And this is worrying, because you can see that there's a lot of strange things going on in his and his advisors' minds. And gee whiz, the last week of Canada and Denmark and Panama have blown a lot of things out of the water. But then the question comes then, is this real, or is this just a distraction from all the other things that are going on? I mean, for me, I go back to one basic premise. We're at war. There is no question about this. There's nothing nice about this. We are at war with Russia, and pretty much we're at war with, if you count what China is now trying to do with pipelines and power lines north of Taiwan, we're at war with China. China is supporting Russia. There is no question about that. What we get from China about what they're doing separately to that is blah, blah, blah. It's just trying to distract us from actually the reality, which is we now have a war against Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran. And it's going on. And it doesn't look like it's going to stop. So, the elephant in the room is Trump. Is whose side's he on? What is he actually going to do? Is he going to make this whole thing worse? Or is he actually going to create something that is stronger than we've had before? There's no question NATO's weak in its attitudes. I mean, it talks a lot. It talks about we haven't been attacked yet. Well, put down all the hybrid warfare attacks for the last 2 years on a list. It comes to pages and pages. And if that isn't something that we should be worried about, then I'm sorry, the world really has gone to sleep.
Absolutely. And that's to ignore even the extraordinary fact of not just North Korean troops, but North Korean artillery pieces, armor.
Yes.
I think it's one
Missiles.
estimate, missiles. 50% of Russia's artillery shells, apparently at this point, at various points in the front, have their origins in North Korea. And
we're doing nothing about it.
And we're doing nothing about it. Yeah.
We're smiling about it. Oh yeah. Well, they're learning. They'll learn so that they can do something in South Korea, and we're doing nothing about it. In fact, we're ignoring it as though it's not happening, but it is.
And I want to come on to the transformations within the Ukrainian military, because that's where you've got extraordinary experience of delivering transformational change, not just in Ukraine, but in other countries that have emerged from, I would call it the Soviet bloc, but the Soviet mindset perhaps might be, a more interesting way to frame it. Before we get to that, let's talk about Putin, because we look at these things in an economically rational way. We look at it through the lens of, our care for life, individual life, and the sanctity of life and the value of human life. Putin clearly doesn't think in that way. We think he's losing. He seems to think that he is winning, certainly based on his recent speeches. Is this a major problem in setting Western policy and reaction to Putin, that we have a totally different perception of victory and loss?
I think it is a huge problem, because lots of things I read show that people don't understand the mindset of Putin. He has clearly set himself the goal of being Putin the Great, typical KGB. He has no care for people. I mean, nobody, apparently even his own children. You know, he sees the human beings as ammunition, frankly. You know, you just expend as many as you need on something. So he doesn't care. He doesn't care about small stuff. You know, why does he feel he's winning? Well, you know, when a NATO and EU chief goes rushing to him for discussions, then he's yeah, you know, Fico. I've got him. Radev in Bulgaria, president, first trip, Moscow to see Putin, and you know, you can add the others. He sees in the political terms, that his aims of breaking up the European Union and breaking up NATO are steadily working. He's removed Britain from the European Union. I mean, the money for Brexit came from Russia, and anybody who ignores that fact is just foolish. The money came, and our innocent and naive politicians took the money and accepted, you know, this without any thought. Greed actually overtook common sense. And this is how he's working all over the place. I mean, it's just money, largesse, promises, and he's gradually, in his view, he's gradually expanding his team. I mean, come on, to get North Korea to join in and come and fight and to give you all its treasure, that's a phenomenal act on its own. So yes, he thinks he's winning. He's got China to one side, Iran chucking loads of stuff at him as fast as they can give it to him. And yeah, he's in a good position, and we don't see that. We think that, oh, economically he's falling apart. Well, North Korea hasn't fallen apart with our sanctions. Not only is it not fallen apart, it's fighting us now. So will Russia collapse with the sanctions? Maybe Putin will be displaced. But then every time you hear interviews all over the place, and the talks of soldiers, they're all 100% behind him. I mean, the fact that North Korean soldiers will kill themselves rather than be taken captive tells you something about the mentality of this whole thing. And I just don't think that in the West we've grasped that the seriousness of what we're facing, the seriousness of Putin, his intent is to destroy us or to capture all the leadership around. And if Trump does what not his bidding, but if Trump is coerced into doing the right things that help Putin, then we really are in deep trouble.
And this is an interesting point you make here, I think, about this idea of, the highly Sovietized North Korean population. And, this is a label we slap on things, but I think there's interesting sort of layers, isn't it? But what Putin represents here is a resurgence of elements of the Soviet mindset. Now we see not that much questioning at all amongst Russians, and not just in the political sense, but also, believing in a sort of greater empire, a greater good, a greater Russia, and they're willing to essentially sacrifice their individuality to that. That's an extraordinary sort of Soviet behavior. But there are different layers of it. The Soviet mindset is also quite hierarchical, whereas the Ukrainians don't, hold their leaders as idols, as almost gods. There is still a persistence of a certain sort of vertical mindset, not questioning authority, say, in a military sense. Now, you've worked to try and transform Soviet mindset armies that have shaped during the Warsaw Pact period. What is your take on what this idea of the Soviet mindset is, and how should it be fought in different contexts, such as the military?
The first thing is we haven't fought it very well. In fact, we fought it badly because we haven't really understood how serious it is. And I mean, there are a whole host of things that run through this that people just don't understand. I mean, the power-based mindset, first of all, that the boss is king, but added on to that are little gems that you find difficult, that you can't tell the boss something because therefore you're saying that he didn't know that in the first place, and therefore he's not clever. So he will be unhappy. So you can't tell him something. You can't tell him something's wrong because he's failed. Not the system. He has failed personally. So therefore, you can't tell him. Now, this, of course, this runs still right the way through the Ukrainian army. It's, you have to remember this one line. It's not a lie to tell someone what they want to hear. And, you have to, people, you need to drive that into people who are dealing with Eastern Europe, because still there are huge amounts of this around. As someone said, okay, people under 30 are coming in with the new Western ways of working. They're looking at the internet. They're understanding equality and the power base shouldn't be as it is. But the older ones still see that as being right. So I mean, I've got a Ukrainian friend here in Riga, and she's 73, and she still asks me things like, is it all right if I walk with you to the bus and things like this? And I said, we're not the Soviet Union. You don't have to ask permission. This is a free country. So the whole concept of like freedom is not there. And that runs right the way through the militaries. And in some militaries, it's still struggling to go, because even those under 30 have been taught and bullied and shaped by those older. So we're going to be maybe another 2 generations in some cases, in some of the militaries, before that attitude goes. And I mean, a fine thing, when you're training people or you're teaching or whatever you want to call it, supporting them in other of these countries, the big thing is you say, no, look, this is really good. And then the next thing they say is, can you tell the boss? Because they can't. So you've got to go and tell the boss. And the 9 times out of 10, the boss will not see you, because he doesn't want to see you, because he doesn't want to be put on the spot that he does not know something. So when you're doing lectures, the bosses will come, they'll speak, they'll give you the grand lecture for an hour at the beginning, and then they will disappear. If you invite them for lunch or something, you'll get to 20 minutes before lunch, and then someone will ring up and say, the boss can't come because he's got an important meeting. They do not wish to be exposed. So you can't teach, you can't help these people grow if they're not actually going to engage with you. So someone who engages with you is very, very rare. So actually trying to create change, it's a matter of finding that one man who's got moral courage. And whether that's because he's the boss's brother or just because he's as he is and he's stronger than everybody else, and you have to find them and then help them, which means that's a 10, 15 year task. It's not a 1 week American course, which doesn't work.
And is this process playing out in Ukraine? Because surely if this was endemic, they would not have survived not just 2022, they wouldn't have survived in 2014. But are these battles,
no, you're missing
through them?
You're missing a point there. The people who are doing the fighting in 2014 and 20 now are society. They are fighting, in most cases, without the support of the leadership. So yes, if the leadership tells them they've got to do something, they have to do it, because that's an order. But if they don't get told, then they can fight on their own. So you've got 2 completely contrasting worlds in the Ukrainian Defense Force at the moment. Society, which is fighting now and doing phenomenally well, and many still with many volunteers. And then the senior leadership, which is, to be honest, struggling to modernize. That's the politest way I can put it. And in some cases, even after 2.5 years, three years of war, of real war, some of the senior leadership are still not grappling with how you use drones in battle. They still see it as individual numbers fighting. So that, even recently, 155 Brigade was sent to the front with 10 drones for a brigade when they probably needed 300, 400 for the fight, and no understanding that this is a drone war. They went there without electronic warfare. I mean, so that means they couldn't kill enemy drones coming towards them.
And of course, they can't make advances themselves.
They can't make advances themselves. So all they're going to do is stand and die, because they're just targets. And the fact that, that happens now, still after all this time, is indicative of the fact that the senior leadership still hasn't grasped how the war runs.
And I guess that comes to the very core of the strategy. In an attritional war, the very strategy is to cede land but inflict a high cost on your enemy. So
Yes.
understanding these mechanics of drone warfare surely are absolutely critical to this and being
Yes.
able to kill Russians at a distance.
Yeah. So you've got what you've got now is brigades and brigades and units creating their own drone unit inside the separate, almost separate from the military system. So of course the trouble with that is then it's chaotic, and that means then that the supply system, the supply system from the government basically doesn't work in many cases, and so they are totally reliant upon um, rich sponsors and family and friends collecting money to buy drones, in some cases even to buy food, and the key bits of equipment that they need, the electronic warfare, the small bits, the batteries, the generators, most of those are coming from volunteers, not just from inside Ukraine, I might add, but French, British, German. There's a lot of foreign volunteers who are driving in and out constantly. Estonia, who are bringing these small things, these small vital things that the government just simply doesn't have a system to be able to do it, to be able to provide them.
Is it also the case potentially that some of these projects may not, they come at a risk of failure? And this is, I think, another key part of the Soviet mindset is, you don't listen to your subordinates because they may be right, but it makes you look bad. But also, if you listen to them, you would have to implement something. And even if it's a good idea, there's a risk of it failing. You cannot be seen to fail because that's the end of your career. How dangerous is that? Oh, first of all, I'd like to know if that's, accurate to your point of view. But secondly,
Yeah.
what is the impact on innovation? And clearly, if you listen to Zaluzhny, he makes the case that innovation is going to be it's going to be the difference between surviving, winning, and being erased in this war.
Um, well, it's vital for innovation, but the innovation is coming primarily from from the a combination of the front line, the technical guys in the front line, many of whom, of course, were just put in there, but with an IT background or an engineering background, I think, and their innovation working back to the companies that they worked with and their friends who are also in IT, and then between them pushing back the ideas. The companies are making the ideas, and then finding money to get the new ways of working forward. So there is this actual working. The government system, the defense system in Ukraine, just can't keep up with it. It wants to, I think, but they just have not got system. So by the time they get round to actually to procuring something, it's out of date. I mean, I give you a short story on this. Is one of my English friends has got a company, a drone company in Kiev, and he produced a drone which he wanted to get accepted so they could purchase, and he put the drone in. 3 months later, the drone came back and they said we want to buy it, and he said, well, we don't make them anymore. We've already moved forward 2 more drones since that one.
Two generations
It's
of
two
innovation.
generations in that 3 months. So, governments are going to find this hard. And this is actually a serious point for NATO, because I still see people writing things about drones, and we got this and we got that. And I want to scream at them, no, you haven't. What you've got is something that you had last year. And if you've got it from last year, I'm sorry, but it's going to be taken out of the sky in the first 5 minutes. And this has happened with a lot of the American drones that have been brought forward, and then they've just gone into the sky, so they don't use them. The
And
other
of course,
thing,
the unit cost. I mean, this is
uh,
another factor. The unit cost of those is massively bloated. So it's
massively
not
inflated.
just an innovation cycle, it's driving down the unit costs
Yeah.
while driving up the features, specs, and
Well,
performance.
well, of course, I mean, what now on the front line, you've got people making stuff out of plastics, and making stuff out of wood, plywood, to get the cost down, around we're still seeing these huge, big ideas of. I mean, the real challenge for these for NATO, for people, is to understand that we have to completely redesign our thinking in terms of how we actually get stuff into the battlefield, if the battlefield is going to change. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but there was something yesterday, um, on I think it was on Facebook, is that the Russians are actually using mobile phones for the cameras. So they're linking them up and then flying a mobile phone over the top and getting all the data out of the mobile phone into somewhere else. I mean, we're not even dreaming of something like that. And this is the thing, is that if this is where we are now after a few years of war, or where we're going to go with robots, ground robots as well, which are also now coming into the battlefield. And we've got these big ones, and they're nice and expensive. And the guys are producing ones that are just big enough to carry a man, and as cheap as they can make them. So there's this whole load of things on technology there, which the Ukrainian society is grappling with, but the defense system is failing to grapple with it. And that tells me that, we're going to have the same sort of problem in UK, the same sort of problem. I mean, we don't have, there is no civil support system for any of the NATO countries other than Ukraine. We don't have a stream of individuals behind finding money, finding bits that we're missing, and helping units. Our units go as they are in NATO, and most of those units have the structure and wherewithal to last for a week if they're lucky. So we just haven't really thought about redesigning our people system, our support system, and everything else. And because the biggest problem is arrogance, military arrogance, and then you could call it professional civil service arrogance. We know best, but actually NATO and the West, we don't know best. And we're not picking up those lessons quickly enough and understanding them enough.
That you answered my next question, which was the serious problems that we're going to have with that. Is it also the case that these solutions can only be innovated where you have an active hot war going on, and where you have this extraordinary communication, which you've described, between battalions that have absorbed civic society elements, supported by them, and have a more open democratic kind of hierarchy within them, i.e. have a competition within the military to see which units can be innovative to break out of that Soviet cycle. And of course, with the sort of Silicon Valley type infrastructure you've got in Lviv, and as you say, people talking to each other. I know of several people who've been on the one side, which is the high-tech side, created charities, made them sort of self-running, and then themselves moved to the front because they saw their roles as actually better, being embedded within battalions, gathering data and so on. So this is extraordinary sort of innovation taking place, but it requires a Silicon Valley style networking, the idea of agility, which you can only get through these sort of tech entrepreneurships, but also the context of a hot war. Is this one of the challenges too?
Yeah, I think so, because we're ignoring it at the moment or hiding away from it. I mean, I just one of the books I was reading is about the Japanese Russian War 1904-5, and when that war started, we sent 26 senior officers to the front line to find out what was going on. Now, I would love to know how many senior officers we've sent, how many general officers we've sent to the front line in this one to have a look at it.
No one's going to tell us that.
They're not going to tell us, but I bet it's not 26. And that is a problem. And the other problem is that, of course, Russia is in the hot war at the moment, so it's learning fast. And North Korea is in the hot war and is learning fast. And I'm absolutely sure that Iran, who's had people in Syria and everywhere else, that their soldiers are learning fast. And I'd be pretty sure that there are plenty of Chinese in the back row trying to find out what the lessons are. If they're not there, someone can correct me, but I am pretty sure that there will be someone there finding out these lessons. Okay, maybe we are, but linking it with, as you say, the technology with civil society and everything else is something we've not even had a discussion about. There's not a discussion about this in UK. I'd be very surprised if there is a discussion about it in the upcoming defence review. of how do we get society engaged, how do we get more people trained, and things like this. I'm waiting to see, because
That's extraordinary. I'd find that idea extraordinary.
if it doesn't contain these key lessons learned from this war, then frankly it needs to go in the bin and start again with someone else who understands what's happening. I mean, we actually have better civil society support back in the Crimea War than we've got at the moment, because we've gone away from it. We had it in the First World War to a degree. Okay, it was mainly people knitting socks. But
or handing out white feathers or
handing
whatever.
out white feathers. It was knitting socks then, and it's now technology.
Yeah.
And you go on LinkedIn, just go on LinkedIn, and you can see all the small firms saying, it doesn't matter what UK is saying, they're not supporting the small technological breakthrough firms. That's it.
Well, I was talking to one of the UK's experts in the manufacture of composite materials for drones, and he collaborates a lot with teams of racing drones. And of course, in the US, a lot of the people who are into the racing drones have connections with the military. So this is one avenue where you can infuse people, but also you can test these technologies to the limits. You can pit them against each other, and because it's quite sexy, you're gonna get sort of rich people coming along and investing in this kit as well. It would seem to me that we were talking about this, sponsoring local clubs with ties to the military, drone racing clubs, and creating all sorts of challenges that they should perform, in the same way that you would have had in every single village green, yew trees growing and people having to, do archery practice on a Sunday if we go back to the Middle Ages and so on.
Yeah.
But there's no conversations you've heard of around civic society.
Not at all. And I think that's, we're almost ignoring that the war is going on. The fact that, despite the fact that, Russian ships are trying to break our communications on a regular basis, and are doing so in the Baltics as we speak, and
with the Chinese assistance,
and north of Taiwan this week. So, if we ignore these things, we're just fools.
When in 2018 you wrote a groundbreaking paper on reforms within the Ukrainian military for the Kiev Post, the challenges, the impact, the results are interesting, but that was a pivotal moment, wasn't it? Because you've got 4 years of military challenge where Ukraine has managed to survive, and indeed, prevent cities such as Mariupol, Odessa from falling into Russian hands, and where it has become apparent, not just the little green men tactics of how Russia co-opted criminal networks, oligarchs, and so on, but also clear how Ukraine mounted, civic society against that, and reversed the hollowing out of the military that you saw under Yanukovych, which is, again, one of the widely ignored things of that Russian puppet ruler. But that's the sort of midway point between then and now, and you've got 2022. So how critical was it, and how far along the route of changes was Ukraine?
The paper was critical, and in the previous to that paper, I think early November, I'd been to the front line, and I went did a long stretch of the front line, not just one place. So I was actually standing literally in the mud, and it was horrible mud, whilst some guys were digging digging trenches in the mud, and the whole of the position was a mess, just a mess, rubbish, Coke cans, everything. It was just a mess. And there were 8 soldiers on the first position I went to. 4 of them were paid regular soldiers, a sergeant and 3, who were standing around smoking and doing nothing. 4 of them were volunteers, unpaid Ukrainians, including the one who was effectively the troop commander, who was a very tall, erudite, intelligent boy, volunteer. So these 4, everything they were wearing and their weapons, they'd paid for themselves, and they were on the front line. And they were the 4 that were. 1 was on guard, 2 were digging, and the troop commander was showing me around. Thankfully, it was extremely thick mist. So the enemy, who were 300 meters away from us, and we could hear them talking, were not bothering us. So I had a good chance to actually to see the mess, to see the position that they've moved from into this new position, which was even worse. I mean, that was just chaos, chaos, ammunition lying on the floor. Um, and and then I went to another brigade, which was actually an official visit. The first one was unofficial. The second one was official, and I got to see actually what they were doing for real with their artillery, where their positions, the putting the guns into these pounds that were then inspected, and then the enemy was given the details where they were, which was not very happy. And the actual state of the brigade, right across all sorts of things I saw, from the state of the toilets to the state of the tracked vehicles. So I came back, and I actually wrote a report on this, and I then realized that the way things were was not the way that Poroshenko was talking about them. And how the army was developing and everything else, and what I could see and what I heard was that not only is it not we're not being looked after, we're not being properly supported in everything. So I wrote this paper, and I gave it to Poroshenko's man, his assistant, and said, please give this to the president. And then I heard nothing for about a week, 2 weeks. And I saw the assistant, and I said, did you give it to him? He said, yes. He said, he put it in the bin. I said, you have got to be joking. And he said, yeah. He said, it's rubbish. I said, okay, that's it. So I went back, I had to think about it, and decided I was going to publish. So I spoke to Kiev Post, and they said, yes, you can publish. I then in good academic fashion, went for heavy peer review and stuck it around about 20, 25 people, both in the Ukrainian military and some Brits and American volunteers who were on the front line, and a couple of other people in the general staff, Ukrainian general staff, and said, okay, pick the bones out of it. Where am I wrong? And all I got back was about 2 lines of actually, it's not 4, it was worse, it was 7. That sort of type of quote. So I gave it to Kiev Post, and of course it absolutely. It was devastating, to say the least. I mean, I think I got around about 2,000 friend requests on Facebook in the next few days. Literally, they just poured in, and people telling me I shouldn't have done it. People telling me it was all lies and everything. In fact, one of the girls I was working with, she was shouting at me. I mean, she's almost pulling her hair out about how can you lie like this? And Poroshenko said how wonderful it was. And her husband was on the front line. He came back at the weekend, and she said, have you read this? He said, yeah. He said, it's spot on, 100% right. So to give her due, she did actually on the Monday come in and apologize and said, I've got this wrong as a member of society. I said, well, the whole of society has got this wrong, because the president is saying everything's okay with the army, and it's not. You're not ready to go to war at all, which they weren't. I mean, they could defend and doing it the way they were doing it, but actually, the war that I told them was coming, and that was February 2018, and I said it's coming, and it's coming soon, and it came exactly as I said it was going to come. They weren't even thinking about it.
The big question, of course, is how prepared then was Ukraine in 2022, and what kind of a steep learning curve was there on the full-scale invasion?
Well, I mean, they weren't prepared in 2022. I mean, I think that some of the officers knew what was coming, but there was a general sort of acceptance around the country that nothing was going to happen, because Zelenskyy was telling people nothing was going to happen, and that everybody was outside who was saying that the attack was going to come was just lying or didn't understand or whatever. Russia won't do this. So the army really was not prepared. I knew that in 2022 that there were a lot of volunteers who were going to go back and fight, because I had a couple of friends who I was talking to in Kiev, and both of them were telling me about all the new kit they've been buying. And please don't tell my wife. But they knew that the people who'd been fighting in 14 and 15 and 16, they knew, who'd then left. They knew it was coming. They could sense it, but the actual military organization, the general staff and things, that they were just ignoring it. They weren't ready at all. And as you know, there were some very, very strange activities at the beginning of the war, where people were pulled away from places that were generally accepted were going to be attacked. And I have not got to the bottom of that, and it will come out in time. There's no question about it. Although, of course, sadly, a lot of the people who know what happened have since been killed. So, but you know, the military is gradually evolving now, and it's evolving because of the number of members of society that are actually joining who are intelligent. So you've now got battalions that have got 2 or 3 PhD engineers and IT people, and those people have got a real grasp of how to take the war forward.
And their tolerance for the Soviet mindset that we talked about, that sort of very hierarchical, intolerant, I don't care if you're wrong or you're right, I'm not going to listen to my subordinates. You know,
No,
these people are not going to put up with that mode
no, and
of
they're not. And
communicating.
there's gradually there's gradual exposure of this, and it's more and more now, and also as more and more members of society begin to understand what is happening on the front line and how the leadership is working. I mean, a lot of credit on this must go to the journalist Patusov, who is laying bare the weaknesses of the system so that they can be improved. And without a lot of his work, we might still be in the dark ages.
Incredibly important. So probably we've only got time for, I think, one more question. Let's turn to, well, we kicked off by talking about Article 5. And we don't know what Trump's going to do. We don't know whether the rhetoric around Greenland, Canada, Mexico is real or bluff or part of some negotiating tactic, or whether it is designed to essentially render not just Article 5 null and void, but to consign NATO to history. We don't know. Because on the other side, we've got these hints that Trump is going to demand that Western partners, NATO members, commit to 5% of GDP, which currently no country, including the US, has actually achieved that level of spend on military. Rather than asking you to predict what's going to happen, what would be the implications of either of those two things? Either Trump doubles down on NATO and forces greater expenditure, or renders NATO essentially redundant.
I think in the first place, the NATO question, which is that you know those who are close to Russia know full well what they're dealing with. Um, uh, you know, whether it's Finland, Sweden, the Baltics, Poland, and whatever happens, they are going to remain close with each other. So the northern group, as it's called now, that northern group will stay there, and one would hope that Canada will stay inside, because Canada is it produces the brigade for Latvia. So there's a real hope there that will stay solid, whatever Trump does, whatever he does. I mean, fine. The rest of it, I have no idea how he's going to turn things and how he's going to shape things, because it's so he is so unpredictable. But I think we have to also remember that, you know, there is a strong Congress still in the US, and you know, there's a huge bipartisan support for both NATO for both NATO and Ukraine. So I think that, you know, he would have great difficulty if he takes things too far. I think the resistance could become quite strong against him in both houses, actually.
And of course, there are enough core members of NATO in Europe that could potentially form alternative security structures, such as Joint Expeditionary Force. I know the UK has been somewhat negligent of that in
Yeah,
recent
yeah.
months and years, but could sort of bodies like that, coalitions of the willing, be something that actually could incorporate Ukraine and Poland, who are the military powerhouses of Europe at this point?
I think so. I mean, I think also we should look at the fact that if we are genuinely and we are facing a challenge from China, which has already started, then we mustn't forget Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, and South Korea, Japan, who I think have got as important part to play as any NATO member. And maybe out of all this, we come up with a different structure of NATO Asia or whatever you want to call it. That is because the world is no longer us and them. It's now missiles are on their way in big time into fighting. Then everybody is at risk. So I think that Trump may upset NATO, but may actually bring together something new. Um, Heaven knows.
As it unfolds, Glenn, we will get you back on the channel to explore. It won't be boring. That's what we can say for certain. But I think we'd all wish that we were living in far more boring times,
Yeah.
which, of course, the 80s, 90s now, upon reflection, were compared to this or the early 2000s. Thanks so much for coming onto the channel. It's greatly appreciated, and especially your insights into the Ukrainian military. And we'd love to have you back on the channel soon.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.